discussion on the topic of climate-related disclosures for the port sector. My name's Andrew Brown. I'm the Deputy Chair of PIANC New Zealand, and on behalf of the committee, we'd like to thank Token and Taylor as the sponsors of this event. We've had great interest with over 90 registrations, so we might see a few people trickle in as we get going. Some of you are members and some of you are not, so I'll start with a short introduction about PIANC for those of you a bit less familiar. So PIANC is a volunteer-run, not-for-profit organisation that brings together people working in the port sector. As you can see, it's been around for a little while. It was first established in 1885 with a name change in 1921 to the Permanent International Association of Navigation Congress, which is where that acronym comes from. But today it's known as the World Association for Waterborne Transport Infrastructure. So yeah, there's 28 national sections globally. Australia and New Zealand are a joint national section, and it's one of the largest with over 100 corporate members. One of the core functions of PIANC is to share technical knowledge. It does this through 4 commissions: the Maritime Navigation, Inland Navigation, Environmental, and the Recreational and Navigation Commission. These bring together experts from around the world to form working groups on a particular topic, and then they prepare publications and guidelines for the benefit of the industry. Had a little trawl of our database, and these popped up as ones relevant to climate change, and they include topics such as managing climate change uncertainties for navigation infrastructure, climate change costs reports, and climate change adaptation planning. PIANC's a membership organisation. With this, you get free access to the publications and guidelines I mentioned, and there's also a number of international, national and regional events, and a dedicated young professional programme as well, as long as a mentoring scheme. We've got a few events coming up across New Zealand, some dates for your diary. On the 5th of June, we're hosting a young professional leadership breakfast at Auckland, Christchurch and Tauranga. And then on the 31st of July, we've got a port tour and technical talk on the Bledisloe Wharf development. And then PIANC's flagship event for the region is coming up in August. It's the PIANC APANC conference, and that's going to be in Brisbane. So yeah, if you wanted to find out more about PIANC, best places to jump on our website shown there. Follow us on LinkedIn. That's where you get updates for upcoming events. And then yeah, do suggest reaching out to the New Zealand committee. We're always looking for speakers on a wide range of topics. So with that, I will keep it short and sweet, and we can get the webinar up and running. I'm going to hand over to Simon Harvey, who's going to be your host today.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks to PIANC for inviting us to collaborate on this interesting and exciting discussion. We're really looking forward to hearing from our panelists. Before we jump into that, we'll just do a traditional opening, and we'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands and waters from which we're all joining today, both here in Aotearoa, New Zealand and across Australia. We pay our respects to First Nations peoples, to tangata whenua, and to the elders, both past and present. And we recognise the enduring relationship Indigenous peoples hold with the environment, waterways and coastlines that sustain our communities and our economies. And we'll talk a little bit more about that today, but I'm going to just quickly skip into a karakia to ground us in this session. Whakatau mai I ronga, whakatau mai I raro, kia u, kia tau. Te Māori tū, te Māori ora, ki te katoa, homie, huie, taikie. Let peace settle from above, let peace settle from below. Let all be aligned and grounded. Let the life force be strong and vibrant for us all. Let's come together and unite in purpose. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to really quickly outline the order of play, and that will be a short introduction from each of our speakers, just 7 or 8 minutes or so, just to give a bit of context to their work, to the 2 ports, and to James's work in the climate disclosure space. Then we're going to go into a bit of a panel session where I'll ask some tricky questions of our panelists, and then we're going to go into an open discussion. So I would encourage you all to keep it lively today. It's always a little bit harder when we're online, but please keep the flow of questions or comments going in the chat. And if you've got any information or resources or anything you want to share, please just drop links in there. Let's make the most of the time together. And we'll weave in any questions that do end up in the chat where we can through the course of the panel discussion. But let's save the other ones then for the discussion at the end. And if we stay on track with time, which is my job, so I will do my very best on that. We should have about 20 minutes or so at the end for some discussion and other questions. So with that, it's my real pleasure to introduce our speakers. We have Crystal Lenky from Lyttelton Port, where she's been for about 8 years, and she's the head of environment and sustainability there. And Crystal has had a long career now in environmental advisory work, and also, interestingly, has a PhD in Antarctic studies. So welcome, Crystal. Thank you. Secondly, we have Ivan Jancek Jurado, and Ivan works at Flinders Port in Australia, and he's the sustainability business partner there. And I found out, just doing a quick bit of research on Ivan, that he also enjoys basketball, travel, and hanging with his cat. And I love people who love hanging with their cat. It's a very therapeutic pastime. And then finally, we welcome James Hughes from Tonkin and Taylor. James is our Technical Director of Climate and Resilience with a strong focus on risk and resilience planning. But in addition, James loves his music. And when we asked him just earlier on with which band he plays in, he couldn't remember which one he's in at the moment. He's playing with about 3 different bands and going on tour shortly with Tabani Tabala. So if he's coming to a place near you, please check him out. He's a very talented musician. So welcome, all of you. Thank you very much for joining us. And I am now going to invite Crystal to give us a short introduction to your work, the context of Lyttelton Port, and a brief introduction to your journey on with climate disclosures, Crystal. So welcome, and I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks, Simon. I'm just going to share my screen. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Yeah, kia ora koutou. Yeah, Simon said, my name is Crystal Lenky. I'm head of environment and sustainability for Lyttelton Port. I've been here for the last 8 years, but have really only been involved with the climate disclosures since 2024. Just a little bit about our team. We're a team of 3. We look after all aspects related to environmental management, sustainability, and planning and policy across our 3 sites. Sorry, there we go. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Lyttelton Port, mainly for our Australian colleagues, we have 3 locations. We have our Lyttelton Port sites, our seaport, and then 2 inland depots that we operate across both within Christchurch and the wider Canterbury region. City Depot, if you're familiar with the port, just over the hill, this is mainly a empty container storage facility, but also a container repair facility. And then we have our Midland Port, which is about 40 kilometers away from Lyttelton. And this was developed in 2016, and it was really to conglomerate all of the agriculture and primary production in Canterbury to here, to Rolleston, and ship it to Lyttelton via rail. So all 3 of our sites are connected both by road and rail. So in terms of Lyttelton Port, we are the 3rd largest port in New Zealand, behind Auckland and Tauranga. but we're the largest within the South Island. Now we do a similar amount of exports and imports, and we have quite a diversity of cargo that do move through Lyttelton. In terms of imports, a lot of bulk cargo. This is largely driven, again, from the agricultural sector. So lots of different types of fertilizers and animal feeds. All of the fuel comes in here to support our airports, all the aviation fuel, as well as LPG for our hospital, and then a variety of containerized imports. In terms of exports, again, most of our containerized exports is related to the agricultural sector, a lot of meat and dairy, as well as coal. We're the only port in New Zealand that exports coal. And a lot of these commodities in our supply chain do form a big part of our transition planning, particularly over the long term. So I guess in terms of disclosure reporting, it has evolved over time. We carried out our first scenario analysis in 2022, and that was following the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure guidelines. And we were starting to report during this time in our annual report. But with the first year of mandatory disclosures in 2024, we revised our scenarios to align with the New Zealand standards, because we didn't include a 1.5 degree scenario from our 22 analysis. And then we revised our scenarios again last year. And that was really to fit in with the wider CCHL group framework. So we aligned our time horizons and climate scenarios across the group. And then we also integrated sector level scenarios. So for LPC, that included transport, tourism, and the agricultural sectors. Now, LPC, we've never been a CRE ourselves, but our owner is, so we're wholly owned by CCHL. But under the new disclosure regime and changes, which I think James is going to go through, CCHL is no longer a CRE, but as a group, we've decided that we will still do voluntary disclosures. So I sit on a sustainability working group along with the other subsidiaries. And so we've made that decision. And reporting going forward is, I think, more straightforward for us, because we do have that group framework that we can report under. We also decided back in 2024 that even though we didn't have to put out our own report, because we went through and did all this work anyways, we did publish our own independent report in 2024 and 2025. We won't be doing that. But we will be reporting within our integrated annual report. And I guess from here, where we're moving forward as a group, we're starting to develop a methodology for reporting anticipated financial impacts. And that's really to ensure consistency across the subsidiaries, so that all the information is provided to CCHL in a consistent manner. So that's where we're heading, I guess, this year and moving forward as a group. Just, I guess, a little bit about risk and opportunities. We have assessed, climate hazards across our portfolio, but for LPC, we have focused on 5 priority assets. Our wharfs, jetties, our dry dock precinct, 3 waters, our transport assets, which includes our navigational channel, as well as road and rail, as well as our electrical systems. So we do own our own 11 kV network at LPC. And I think in terms of physical risks, we're probably in a pretty good spot. And the reason for this is we have had quite an intensive period of upgrades and repair to Lyttelton Port following the earthquakes that hit Christchurch in 2010 and 2011. So there's been a lot of repair to particularly our three waters assets, electrical, our wharfs and jetties. We have been taking into account sea level rise as well. Implemented a lot of new technology, looking at wind forecasting, as well as weather monitoring. But we know that, some structures, we have like our dry dock, which dates back to, I think it's the 1860s. There's not much that we can do in that space. We can't really raise it. But I guess in terms of for us sea level rise, we know that through a lot of the work that our city council has done, compared to other areas of the harbour, we are less susceptible to sea level rise in our current location, which is good, but we are taking that into account, particularly in the long term. In terms of transition risks and opportunities, our main focus is, or one of our main focuses is on decarbonisation and technology. We know it's and I'm sure this is the same across other ports, a lot of capital expenditure to change over fossil fuel assets, but that is a focus for us, particularly in terms of electrification. We know that we import and export carbon intensive commodities. So, say, for example, our coal yard and our tank farm, how do we repurpose some of these facilities into the future? Coal, it's likely going to be a sunset industry. We don't know what is going to happen in the short to medium term in this space. And I guess where are we at today? So we have developed our transition plan. We have three, main ambitions, three main pillars. The first is reducing our GHG emissions, and this is very much a focus on implementing our emissions reduction plan to ensure we meet our 2030 and 2050 targets. But it's also working with our stakeholders to ensure that we are reducing emissions within our value chain. We have, as part of the CRD process, gone through and looked at the entirety of our Scope 3 emissions and are reporting on most of our value chain, including emissions from ships that are visiting the port. In terms of our port resilience, this is very much focused on ensuring that LPC becomes the main hub for the South Island. And this is going to be through our proposed expansion. We've reclaimed 16 hectares of land. We're going through another 7 at the moment and going through a detailed design around a new wharf and also an automated and low carbon container terminal, and accounting for sea level rise at the same time. And then in supporting our community, this is very much around partnerships. So how do we work with our CCHL subsidiaries and to support the transition of Christchurch and Canterbury, how we work with other ports. We're members of the Sustainable Business Council as well as Climate Leaders Coalition, and then also supporting our customers to ensure that we're providing efficient and low carbon logistics solutions for them as well. And then lastly, I guess just a plug for nature-related disclosure reporting. We produced our first TNFD report in 2024. This is on our website. We are looking to do quite a large update to that this year. And then, moving forward, we know that nature, climate, it's very intrinsically linked together. So how do we report both climate and nature in a cohesive and integrated way? So look out for that report. It'll be coming out October, November this year. Yeah, that's all for me.
You're on mute, Simon.
Thank you, Crystal. Fantastic summary there. And look, congratulations. The first port in New Zealand to get a TNFD report out following the leaders around the world. So that's fantastic news, and also a very powerful nature positive goal there set by LPC for the harbour. So Yvonne, I'm going to hand over to you. We're going to go back in time, 2 hours to you in Australia. So we look forward to hearing your short introduction.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Crystal. So yeah, just a quick little bit about myself. I am a sustainability advisor for Flinders Port Holdings. So I work under the sustainability manager in the governance team. I've been at Flinders Ports for about 10-ish months, but I've worked in the climate risk space and sustainability for about 4 years, mainly in consulting around, sort of climate disclosures and risk there and resilience as well. Before that, my background was more in engineering. So the focus of my work at Flinders Ports has been on these climate disclosures and also all things sustainability. And given my engineering background, turning these disclosures into useful work for the assets and maintenance team to increase the resilience of our infrastructure, that's been a big goal of mine working here as well. So just a little bit more about Flinders Ports. So we're a privately owned company. So for the Australian accounting standards, that means we're like non-listed, won't have to publish a report, but we still need to produce this report this year. So for those from New Zealand, Australia's probably about a year behind in the reporting, and we're a Group 1 reporter. So this will be our first process going through that. Flinders Ports, we operate across 6 regional ports in South Australia, and also Port Adelaide, which has a few facilities in there, and our main container terminal is there as well. We facilitate in SA over $25 billion of international trade. So this includes things from grain to agricultural products, also mining exports, fuel, fertilizer, and also containerized freight. Interestingly, we also have a hydro survey team, and so they collect a range of data, including sea level rise and geospatial mapping, which has been really useful for us as well. Our vision and mission is to connect South Australia to the world and to be an industry leader in doing this in a safe, innovative, and sustainable manner for our customers. So for climate change at Flinders Ports, the first step we went through in this process was using a heat tool, which gave us exposure at each of our ports for these hazards. And I did this along with a desktop analysis using the hydro survey data, some ACS, which is Australian Climate Services, and BOM, Bureau of Meteorology. So I just wanted to show the heat tool just to show what sort of assessment we looked at. This gave us an overview of each of the ports since we had multiple sites, and then gave us a good idea of what our exposure was across those assets. We also have, this is incorporated in a dashboard with our nature work as well. So we did that and are working through the nature strategy there. So it's going to be really interesting to see Crystal's work after as well, to sort of bounce off the ideas off that as well. And we think that this is going to be really useful for assets and operations in the next financial years. We start to try roll this out so they can get an idea of this as well, with some future modelling data in there too. So from this, the main high risks we saw was things such as sea level rise, storm surge, heat, drought, and extreme weather. A big one for us is the high winds affecting operations. So that is due to ship to shore cranes and the safety procedures there, meaning that we can't operate above certain wind levels. And then also for safety reasons, and also when the ships come in, when they're calling in, we at times have to delay that if there's high winds as well. Drought was also an interesting one. So that's when you're looking at the broader value chain. We had drought come up as a high one from agricultural throughput decreasing. So if we have consistent long droughts and reduced rainfall, that could have an impact on the port as well. And it's a bit more of an indirect risk that we didn't see until we started to zoom out of the picture a little bit there. Similar to what Crystal was mentioning, decarbonising infrastructure and operations is a significant cost when we're looking at technology like ship-to-shore power. Also, the interest in that from the ships coming in as well, and also alternative fuels, and some quite significant cost differentials when we're looking at things like the hybrid-enabled pilot vessels, for example, as well. At the same time here, though, there are strong opportunities for us to support the low carbon industries and the future trade flows, especially commodities. And we're already seeing some of that now with increased EVs coming through, and also the wind turbines and those sort of aspects as well already coming through the port. I also just wanted to show some good examples we have here that we've been doing at the port from Marnie. So from my boss had been working on this previously. We have some CEFC, which is green financing. So Clean Energy Finance Corporation here. And for that, it's been able to help us facilitate things such as this battery hybrid straddle carriers, which has already been quite useful. So they consume 36% less fuel, but then also they've been used a lot more lately now that they've been rolled out there, and are favoured by the operators out there as well. Also electric forklifts and hybrid light vehicles, which we've been trying to roll out as well. We also had a new pilot boat fleet, which has helped. They're more fuel efficient as well, and they're hybrid ready, but I haven't quite. They can accommodate it, but they aren't there yet. That's just due to the cost differential as well, but something we're looking at actively. We also have a carbon farm, part of the nature work as well, which is been really interesting, and that's part of also with these disclosures coming out has been helpful to help push this out a little bit more. And this should be something we actually have, I believe, contract going up and should happen in the next few months, which is exciting. So for the disclosure work for Flinders Ports, so we're a Group 1 reporter in Australia. As I mentioned, this will be our first climate disclosure, and we're in the final stages of drafting our sustainability report. This was developed jointly with finance, given they're the ones doing the financial statements. A lot of the ownership at the end ends up with them, but we support them through that process. Something that's worked well was the cross-functional engagement. So we had workshops and touch points with all the different business units throughout. And next financial year, we plan to expand the working group to individuals from each of those teams to really help with that quantification, adaptation, and transition planning, since we really want the ownership to go up towards their own teams as well. We used SSP 3 to 7 for high emissions and SSP 1 to 2.6 for low emissions. There's consideration here for moving to SSP 1 to 1.9, depending on audit expectations. So this is something that we're talking with the auditors with, as SSP 1 to 2.6 lines up with about 1.8 degrees, and the standards are asking for a limit of 1.5. So might be something we have to move to, and it's something we're considering. What's worked well is the working groups having structured workshops throughout, especially early on, to upskill the different teams and also prioritize our risk and opportunities, and develop a detailed project plan throughout, where we were able to sort of list off everything and make sure we're fulfilling those requirements. Biggest challenges is, as I imagine many reporters are seeing, is the quantification of these impacts, how we aggregate the risk and opportunities, and then also what to include in the disclosure reports. Being from sustainability, you want to include so much, while the finance wants to really get that down more succinctly. That is, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Ivan. Really appreciate that quick tour of your ports. Let's hand over to James now, get a bit of context from James and your work more broadly in this area. Over to you.
Thanks, Simon. Hi, everyone. My name's James Hughes. As Simon mentioned, I lead our climate and risk practice in New Zealand and Australia. And just by way of introduction, we've worked with a wide number of entities that do require disclosures in New Zealand. And yeah, it's been a very interesting journey around the technical side, and I guess over the last few years, how to implement and undertake the assessments required, but also talking, as Simon and I have been, to many of those who read and the investment side as well, and what they are looking for. So I'll touch on some of those points very briefly. I'll just share my screen. And I'd like to begin with this. It's hot off the press. This is an hour ago released, New Zealand's their second national climate risk assessment. And while people were talking, I grabbed this image. It mentions ports and airports, and I haven't counted the number of rows down, but this is roughly an order of risk. So it's probably 2/3 of the way down. So the national view from New Zealand is that ports and airports are at moderate risk currently, moving to extreme late in the century. So I encourage people to go and look at the detail in there, but I just thought I'd pull that out. There's quite an interesting finding. Also, in terms of the method that's been used. So this year for the National Risk Assessment, they've looked at risk severity, this comment here, this heading called policy readiness, and they've also given it a cascading risk score. So lots of stuff to dig into there if people are interested. However, coming back to the disclosures, I've just got a few slides. So first, just a reminder for people, the goal of climate-related disclosures. Number one, ensuring that the effects of climate change are routinely considered in businesses, investment, lending, and insurance underwriting decisions. Number two, helping climate reporting entities better demonstrate responsibility and foresight and how they're managing climate issues. And lastly, leading to more efficient allocation of capital. So helping smooth the transition to a more sustainable, low emissions economy and also a climate resilient economy. Comparing the two regimes is quite interesting. New Zealand has originally 200 entities that needed to disclose, and we've since reduced that. There's only around 75, and they're large financial market participants. Australia by 2030 will have 6,000, so a big change. New Zealand, we started the process in 2023, so there's been a lot of learning and a lot of experience gain, maturity, etc. over the last couple of years, and obviously Australia's in their first year. The thresholds there, New Zealand was at $200 million. Now we pushed that up to the $1 billion market capitalisation. So that's been why the numbers dropped down to 75 who are required to disclose. Australia has those a range of different criteria, which are the thresholds, but you can see that in the bottom box there. So I wanted to just talk about, and this is reflecting a little bit on Crystal and Ivan's commentary, but the uniqueness of ports in the context of climate. I found this, really interesting when you dig into it. Number one, ports exist in a high hazard exposure environment. So they're often near coasts, rivers, exposed to extreme weather, heat as well. And they also have potential vulnerabilities that are quite unique for their context. So, often on reclaimed areas of land, have seawalls and wharves exposed, and often they're quite old, they're long-lived assets that can age and become vulnerable. Vertical structures, very high vertical structures, obviously, and also the fact that a lot of the channels need constant dredging, and that factor, I think, is quite unique and creates a high exposure to hazards. They are probably unique in the fact that they are highly interdependent on so many factors. So you can imagine, obviously, you've got power, access, road and rail, communications, fuel being in a very strong interdependency there, labour. That's for the port itself, let alone the various throughput goods sectors, if you like, that each port is related to. So lots of very complex interdependencies in this global supply chain, and we're seeing the impacts of some of those supply chains being interrupted as we speak. The next one I thought was interesting was the criticality from an economic perspective. So obviously ports are essential for inflow and outflow of goods, which particularly in New Zealand's context, we don't manufacture very much at all anymore. So any interruption to the inflow of goods to our economies has direct economic impacts, and are nationally significant economic impacts. I think the macroeconomic contexts also directly impacts on ports, and I think the insurance part is also worth talking about if we have time as well, around the implications of climate on insurance and finance in the context of ports in the broader economy. Next one, long-lived assets. Ports have unique long-lived assets, walls, sea walls. That has implications for how we think about adaptation, and I'm not sure if we'll have time to talk about it, but I think, ports are very difficult to adapt, given you can't just move them very easily, given the sunk costs that have gone in. So when we're thinking about adaptation, what sea level rise allowances should we think about? Do you protect? Do you think about relocating or retreating? I think processes like dynamic adaptive pathways are uniquely suitable for application in these contexts as well, something to think about. And lastly, the exposure to transition risks. I think both Crystal and Ivan talked about this in brief, but the compounding nature of transition risk in the port context, so obviously import and export of fuel, the shipping fuels, the electrification challenges around shore power, carbon pricing that's emerging, all these factors. So lots of angles here for climate risk for ports. Next couple of slides are just some reflections. So with that context, I just want to have one slide on technical reflections and one more on, I suppose, what we're seeing in the market and when we're talking to users of the climate-related disclosures. So first one is the value chain and materiality. So Crystal had a really nice diagram of their value chain, and I think, Ivan, you were alluding to this as well, when we're thinking about climate risk, we need to be very clear on which part of the value chain we're talking about. Is it the entire value chain? Is it only the material elements of that value chain? And on what basis are we deciding whether something is material or not? So ports, again, the uniqueness of the breadth of their value chain make this a very critical and arguably difficult thing to get your head around in terms of where you put your boundaries on your assessments. This curly thing around scenario planning, and I'll make the observation that I think the processes and application of scenario planning in New Zealand is quite different to how it's being applied in Australia. Not always, but that's my early kind of view of this. It'd be interesting to pick this up, Ivan, how you're thinking about this. In New Zealand, there was a lot of effort put into sectoral scenarios developed. And the example on the screen there is the transport sector climate change scenario. So sectoral representatives came together, developed narratives. So there's been a narrative-based process in New Zealand, and most disclosing entities have taken basically a foresight-driven approach to building narrative scenarios. In New Zealand, we have to do 3 of them, a 1.5, a greater than 3 degrees, and 1 other. Australia, there's only 2 that are required, minimum, and those are, I think, a 1.5 aligned and a greater than 2 degrees, I think. So, and I'm interested in whether this narrative-based approach is occurring in Australia, or I've seen examples where it's more, I suppose, just looking at climate models and looking at the physical impacts of those and less narrative-based, but it'd be interesting to pull that out. Ivan, you mentioned this, that the challenge with granularity, and I think this is going to continue. The most value, I think, from an entity level is going very, suitably deep on your risk assessments. That's where you get the decision useful information and insights. But the disclosure challenge is you can't disclose 150 risks. So you end up rolling these up, and the more you roll them up, I think there's a risk of them becoming less meaningful and offering less insight. So there's a real balance there and a challenge around the granularity of disclosing these risks. Quantifying financial impacts. We've just actually, Simon and I put a little paper together on some challenges and some approaches to quantifying financial impacts. I think we've got to be very judicious about which risks, if you like, we choose to take through to quantification, and what criteria mean, yep, we've got enough information, we've got a methodology that we can stand behind, and therefore we're going to try and quantify it. I think those decision points need to be sort of well thought through. Otherwise, there's a lot of uncertainty in that. And lastly, credible transition planning is something that's emerging. Where does transition planning sit? How is it connected to strategy? How does it link to scenarios and risks? And something that we've been putting a lot of thought into as well. And on the markets and investor side, just a few sort of thoughts. We're seeing, I guess, an evolution and maturity, and in that sense, a bit of a simplification in how some of the disclosures are being put out in the second and third years. So where you might have seen very deep, very long, complex, wordy reports, those are becoming less intensive, which is good, and that's driven a lot by when we've spoken to a few on the investment side. We asked them, what are you most interested in? Most people say we want to know what the risks are, how they're being managed, and what the strategy is more broadly on climate and addressing those risks. So having that information up front, really accessible, rather than a whole bunch of stuff on governance, on risk management processes, etc., which takes often a lot of airspace or page space and takes a bit of wading through. Moving towards decision useful assessments that aren't just aimed at disclosure. And this is probably a given, if you like, but I think where we've seen most success and buy-in within organisations who've done this well, it's where the execs and senior management have seen the value in doing the work outside of the disclosure. And I know I'm interested in, again, Ivan and Crystal's experience with that. I know that there's mixed experiences in different organisations, but I think trying to tease out those parts that have broader value for the business then helps cement the value of doing some of these risk assessments and scenario planning pieces. And lastly, the integration piece. So integrating the scenario and risk assessment, the adaptation and mitigation plans. I'm using that language there instead of transition plans, and I think that's more used, adaptation and mitigation, in the Australian context, with the company-wide strategy investment plans. And I'll give you an example. When we've seen some of the scenarios that have been done historically, often you see people in a sustainability team running workshops within their organisation, developing these climate scenarios, and then over the partition, there's the team working in the strategy department, and they've got some detailed models that are often forecasting and having projections around the same factors that are in the scenarios that the other teams are doing, but they're not talking to each other. So I think looking at how we can integrate particularly the more quantitative side of scenarios and risk assessments within these different teams. And I'll just finish with this slide, is really around giving a bit of an example again. We did some work for a large energy company, and our task was, how do we take their big hamburger stack on the left, which was their current climate related disclosure, and make it more readable and much slimmer. And we ended up changing the order, leading, if you see on the right, instead of the standard order, which is governance, risk management, strategy, metrics and targets, we flipped it around, leading with the climate context, straight into strategy, and then putting a lot of stuff in the appendix. So that's all I had there, Simon, and happy to pass back to you.
Hey, James, and we love the hamburger diagram. That became one of the CFO's favorite picture. Look, thank you for those introductions. As is often the case, the introductions take a little longer than anticipated, but it's been great to get some really rich information. The challenge we now have is to compress a few questions into a slightly shorter time. So I'm going to ask our panelists, a little bit like, what's it called, the chase, to get through as many questions as we can in a short period. So let's focus on answers that are what you think the audience are going to be most interested in. And I'm going to ask you, Crystal, first. because you're several disclosure cycles into this work now, and I wonder, looking back, what has delivered the most tangible business value beyond meeting the disclosure requirement for LPC?
Good question. Thanks, Simon. I think going through this process, it really elevated climate change as a risk to the table. When we did our first disclosure reporting, I guess XRB reporting in 2024, following that, we elevated climate change to one of our top 10 strategic risks within the company. And then we also, I guess, reconstituted one of our board meetings, board committees from health and safety to health, safety, environment, and sustainability. And that was to really give more oversight and focus to physical and transition impacts and the opportunities. So it was really about elevating that risk. So I think that's where we saw I guess the most business value, and that has then over the last 2 years transitioned into more of our business strategy. We didn't have, you can see that from our statement to be New Zealand's most sustainable port, and that's very much a reflection of not only the climate work but the nature work that we're doing.
Thank you. Thank you. Yvonne, early days for you guys, but what do you think is emerging in that view? I mean, in terms of the tangible business value that's coming from the exercise, what's your feeling on that?
Yeah, I think in anticipation of all the disclosures coming up and then the transition planning as well, really that CAFC financing and being able to start pushing through, the hybrid straddles and the pilot vessels, and then that's not only had sort of an impact on these decarb targets, but also like the return on investment that stacks up. So it's been, for tangible business value, it's been easier to push those things where it also makes economic sense at the same time. So currently we're also looking at like solar and batteries, and then that's really being pushed through by this development, and then being able to grow the team because of these disclosure requirements, and then ownership as well throughout the other teams has started to get those teams, get the cogs turning a bit and get them thinking about it. I think interestingly as well, someone's question was around like the roads leading into the port, and then for us it was like the roads and the rail leading in, looking at the broader context rather than just our direct impacts of what's happening around in the supply chain, and given the geopolitical context side as well is starting to get people thinking about how can we transition and having these plans in place. So I'd say there is where we've seen that sort of value, and the upskilling during the workshops has really led to that as well. And then also just not siloing the climate risks separately, being able to incorporate it, both our quantification and enterprise risk framework all together. So with quantification, we're trying to look at, we have financial models for commodities. How do we incorporate the scenarios into that? And just to James's point, I think there's still that bit of development around narratives where we're more just using models at the moment. So yeah.
Interesting. And just a point of interest there, and for the green finance, the CEFC finance, is the disclosure work that required for that, or are there parts of it that are required? And then what's the sort of discount that you're getting on that type of financial arrangement?
I wouldn't be able to speak on the exact discount, but I know there is a better rate there, and there is requirements for disclosing. So we have scope 1 and 2 targets, and then setting a scope 3 target is one we're doing, I believe, this financial year leading into next financial year. So working on that diligently at the moment. That one's quite difficult with the vessels coming in and the IMO pushing back when they set their targets, that it's been difficult to see how we can't really influence the ships coming in. So yeah, that's been an interesting case there.
Thank you. Crystal, in terms of executive and board engagement, what did you find resonated most effectively with the execs and boards, and what didn't? What caught their attention most effectively?
probably the cost from the start when we first presented some of this transition planning. And if we looked at, our decarbonization pathway, just the amount of capital that was, was going to be needed to transition our assets, that caught their attention. I think, like Yvonne, a lot of our work was done in conjunction with our exec teams, as we went through the workshops and developed the scenario analysis and rated our, material impacts. They were very much involved with that. I think what resonated probably too with the board is, James touched on it. They wanted to know what our risks were, how are they being managed, and what are the cost. We didn't really, I think, get too much into the minutiae of how we developed the scenarios from the board. That's not what they were interested in. I think LPC, we're also on two parallel pathways in terms of decarbonization, and it very much depends on what the outcome is of our expansion. So that's something that we needed to show. But I think, just showing that, these are the risks, are the mitigation and controls, these are the current impacts, this is our management response, and actually how we're tracking, and that's what they want to see, at least for LPC.
Thank you.
I don't think we got a lot of pushback on certain things, and certainly we're not seeing any comms coming down from our exec and board now that we're no longer reporting up to, say, CCHL in that mandatory reporting sense. It's, hey, we've done all this work, we're just going to keep on going with it. And that's been really great to have that communication come down from the board and the exec.
Great, thank you, Crystal. Very, very quickly, Yvonne, what really struck a chord with your board and executive team? What caught their attention?
Yeah, honestly, similar to Crystal there, I think the cost of some of those transition requirements, but they also, there was probably also on using proven technology, not really, that you can, I think pilot projects help, but just having peers doing similar things, so sort of aligning with that around the Australian and international ports. So that's really what we were trying to align to. But I don't haven't engaged as much with the board, but that's from my understanding, that's what's been happening.
Thank you. James, is that consistent with what you've been seeing more broadly across infrastructure organisations or climate reporting entities more generally?
Yeah, I think there's it kind of goes hand in hand with that evolution and maturity, and the focus being on, naturally, I think there's a short-termism that's built into our organisations, but so there's a natural focus, I think, on risks, particularly those obviously that are more short-term. I think the port context, as we were saying earlier, is slightly different given the long-lived nature of the assets, right? And so you're forced to think a bit longer. I'd be interested also in whether the current fuel crisis is kind of changing the balance a little bit around particularly the transition discussions and going, actually, the business case has flipped a little bit given, or may, if prices keep going up. But yeah, Simon, to answer your question, very, very similar. And I think just this focus on pragmatism, and there has been a challenge with the scenarios, I think, the scenario process and making that land in sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? A way that kind of immediately time-constrained board members can go, oh, I understand this, I understand why we're doing it, and I understand the process. Because it is a little bit, the way it's set out, requires time. It's a new process, and it is sometimes a little bit subjective in terms of how it's applied, if not done well, yeah.
And of course, scenarios have been used for strategic planning for a long
That's
time,
right.
to test strategy and business model into different situations. From what you've seen, James, where have scenarios really worked well, or how have you seen them being tweaked or adjusted as the process has matured to get more value out of the time and investment in that work?
I like to make the difference between entities or businesses that are, I'm going to use the word climate adjacent, i.e. you've got obvious and very material connection to climate drivers. So if you're in the energy sector and you've got hydro dams, or if you're in the agricultural sector and you rely on the climate to grow food, or in your case, if you're a high, if you're the port sector, I'd say that would be very climate adjacent, right? In terms of fuel costs, supply chains, the impact of fuel. Most of those sectors have, I would imagine, there's probably a question and a statement at the same time, people doing models in your strategy team about how does more rainfall affect our generation of our hydro dams? How does more drought affect the demand for different electricity, or the level of milk that we produce? So when we're doing scenarios, we need to connect those two. That's where I think the value is bringing the more quantitative part into the scenarios. We can go, actually, we built this narrative scenario through a robust process, but we're now going to test that in a model that can give us an idea of how it impacts on our bottom line. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And look, there's a really good question from Dale in the chat, which I'm just going to save for a moment, because I think we'll come to that. We're just going to see if we can squeeze one more in before then. And again, just really practical level, particularly for those organisations that are looking to get more value out of this. Crystal, starting with you, can you point to one or two decisions that genuinely changed because of this work, that either accelerated or might not have otherwise been made as a result of this work, and how did that happen?
Yep. I guess an example is, our transition planning. And we've kind of touched on it already, is, I think it's clearly outlining and what resonated with management and our board is that where technology exists and where we can make the biggest, reductions. And that has really, in terms of, say, LPC, that's in our container handling fleet, we have, our straddles make up 57%, I think, of our, emissions. We know there's technology there. For our pilot boats, we know that there is an electric alternative. I think it was clearly outlining what's available right now, what's in the future, where to focus our efforts. Because if I look at LPC, changing over our light vehicles and heavy vehicles doesn't really do much for us. And also that key piece, and Yvonne had touched on it, is that ROI, that return on investment. It's getting that information and working with the teams in the who are developing those business cases. So starting on that level, that this is the targets, this is where LPC is moving. And I think once management and working with our finance teams, they see that ROI and how that plays out over time, that is, we're not going to go and just replace our assets, with diesel, because that's what we've always done. So I think that's at that basic level has really resonated. And I think you need to make the decision that you might be the first to do something, to implement a change. So don't be afraid to do it. That's kind of taken a little bit of time to come across, but before shore power wasn't ever really an option. We now have a shore power project in our harbor. We are now looking at shore power for our expansion. So it's, I guess, not being afraid to be the first. And I think we're kind of getting over that hump here at LPC.
Thank you. And actually, just on that, obviously the return on investment there is really critical, and things have shifted a little bit over the last months. But Yvonne, you mentioned that I think you mentioned earlier that you worked quite early on with the finance team, and that they were actually cutting back some of your report. What was the difference of getting the finance team on board and involved early on?
Yeah, so I think the difference there was especially with the assurance process is that everything, getting looked at and going to that process is you really want to make sure, you did before, but even more so, you want to make sure that what you're saying is correct and complete like avoid greenwashing and those sort of aspects. But also something that was interesting going to the ASB and ASRS workshops is the auditors are actually asking you to have early conversations with them around, disclosures. And this is not something that the finance team was probably used to. So they were like, no, we're not allowed to talk to the auditors beforehand. But in this case, it was something where it being new is actually encouraged. So that was something new that maybe the finance team wasn't expecting. But it was a good mix of the two teams and cutting it down. That was partly also because of board wanting a more succinct report, something that's a bit easier for them to digest while also still including all the important information as well.
Yeah, and that's certainly something we've heard as we've talked to investors and analysts is that they're way too long and the right information is not up front, so they're really thinking about the audience. I would like to now just jump to the question that Dale put in, because we've talked a little bit about risk and sort of direct and indirect risk at a high level, and there's a related question in the Q&A part of the app here. But Dale, do you want to ask this question yourself? It's a really interesting one. Dale, I think from Port of Tauranga and the Bay of Plenty. And Dale, did you want to ask that question if you're still online?
No, I'm still here. So just short bit of background. When we ran all the direct and indirect risks to ground for Port of Tauranga, we concluded that the main area for potential financial impact was actually around the reorganisation of freight flows. So how composition and volume might adjust, taking into account the fact that you do have the ability to retool port sides, so you don't have this enduring missed opportunity because you're now misaligned with the freight flow. But that tended to be the biggest area, both of risk, but then also of uncertainty. Because, for example, if you're primarily an export led port and it's mostly primary sector exports, you don't know for sure how, for example, land use and those agri systems will reorganize, and then what the resulting recomposition of export might entail. So that's been the biggest area we've grappled with. But we spent a lot of time looking at each individual value chain that key exports and imports belong to, screening them for exposure individually to physical and transaction drivers, and then understanding what those key risks might be. Again, primarily to understand, the wharf side requirements and how they might shift.
Good, Dale. So, actually, let's, James, just jump to you quickly first on this. So what's your broader sense of the way that organisations have tackled some of these sort of value chain risks and the potential disruption that is, as Dale said, there's a lot of uncertainty there. You don't really know quite what's going to happen.
Yeah, at a high level, I'd say most organisations probably have a line item that says supply chain risks. And so at a high level, I think ports, as we've been talking about, are unique. And what Dale's pointing to, and Dale's done a great job with Port of Tauranga, is really digging into detail. And it comes back to, Ivan, to your point around the level of detail of these risk assessments. And I think, you can go forever. And obviously you wouldn't, but how deep do you go on these value chains? And I think that's a judgment and relating to the context and the nature of the risks. But I think I would agree with Dale's assertion that for ports, that is a significant risk. So I think it's a real challenge.
Let's quickly. Crystal, you talked a lot about coal, which I think we'd all probably say or hope that we know it's a sunset industry. We know that the use of coal globally is plateaued and will fall. Other sectors that might be exposed, whether that's agriculture, and we can see some impact on that at the moment, fertilizer and what have you. But what is your, in a nutshell, what was your conclusion as to how to evaluate those risks and how to essentially manage them?
Yeah, it doesn't sound like we went into as much depth as Tauranga. We did do a light touch on this last year, but it is an area that I think we need to look further into. potentially, given that we do have diverse commodities and we do, we aren't generally just an export-import. We do 50-50 almost. Maybe potentially a bit more insulated from that. But obviously we know that, meat and dairy, that could change, less herd size, what's going to happen, so, sunset industry, coal, it is coking coal, it's not thermal, so that might change, but also that's probably more from a regulation and whether people get consent to extract. Thinking about how we then diversify our imports and also probably more our exports in that space. But something that we do need to look further into.
Thank you, Crystal. And I can see Dale's put his hand up again, but I'm just going to give Yvonne a quick chance just to give their perspective on, what work you've done in that space and anything that you have that stood out to you, I guess, as a red flag, or how you've managed that uncertainty.
Yeah, so for us, it was just looking at the commodities, like what we're trading, and then just going from the top to bottom where the risk could be. So drought with grain, for example, a big one we looked into, and then talking with like working groups of agricultural industries to ask what data they're getting. So Rabobank, for example, has some good insights as well. And then also with the fuel, we have a 50-year master plan, and before all this disclosure work, we're actually already considered the fact that fossil fuels are going to decrease, but then they're expecting an offset from commodities coming in as well. So just extracting that information and getting it into our, disclosures has been, that's been what we've been working on.
Thank you. Dale, final comment or thought or question?
Sorry, I was just going to say, I acknowledge it's really tricky because in a way, ports are kind of like an expression of the national or regional economy that they're attached to. So you can't be expected to do a climate change risk assessment for the whole country's economy. And that goes to James' point, the agonizing sort of decision process around how you set boundaries was the biggest test for us. Yeah.
Thank you, Dale. Really good question. And related to that, we have a question from Ben as well. Ben, did you want to just ask your question if you're still online?
Yeah, sure. Hello. I guess it sort of is related to the other one, but it was sort of around looking at sort of at the point that Dale just made as well around exposure to the port itself, but also the successful operation of the port requires you to be able to access the port, and often these roads are lower lying or not designed to the same standards as the port itself. And is that something that's sort of routinely considered in these, or more of a nice to have, or out of scope entirely?
Yeah, so things like the roads leading and the infrastructure that connects the port to other places. And we see this in other sectors as well, where they are essentially at risk of a supply chain that comes through a narrow corridor of the country, like Auckland Airport and what have you, that for Auckland, everything comes through that port. Let's start, James, very quickly. Yeah, we've only got a couple of minutes left. So what are you seeing?
Well, Ben, I think it's a choice. First thing, I mean, these are all kind of scope choices. Just to give you an example, we just done a project for not a port, but a large big box retail outfit, and we didn't look at all the roads, but we did an assessment, I think, within like a 3 kilometer circuit of their site, and looked at different categories of important roads and did a little bit of sort of spatial analysis, and gave them some data that said, well, this particular site, all the roads in that, this X% of the roads in your vicinity are underwater in a 1 in 10 year event or something. So there are obviously ways to do it. It's just how deep do you want to go, I think, is probably the answer to your question. Yeah.
Thank you. And Crystal, I mean, interesting from you, I guess, you have had the earthquake there 15 years ago. So, you're acutely aware, I guess, of the fragility of some of the infrastructure that connects the port to other parts of the local community and economy. What would your quick thoughts on this one be?
Yeah, I mean, the main supply into the port is via road and rail tunnel. These did survive the earthquakes really well. And I guess in terms of if we're looking at climate hazards, that's low risk. We do have two other roads leading out of the port. One is, I guess, what would be almost like a tertiary supply route, and we know that is very much could be underwater at some point in the future, but it's not one of our primary routes. I think probably for us, it's maintaining our navigational channel. We have a lot of sediment that comes into the channel from Pegasus Bay that is very much outside of our control. We've got major rivers in New Zealand that pump out sediment during storms. So it's, how do we manage that? So in our berth pockets, so probably from a transport point of view, it's more of that focus on the channel. But I guess further afield, we have seen, due to landslips, particularly on the rail line, New Zealand's rail is quite vulnerable to, I think, climate change. We've seen that on the Buller line, coal couldn't come through, it had to be trucked quite a distance into the port. So, and I guess further afield from that, we do look at, when I think was it the Suez Canal when it was really low and had to be rediverted. So I think it's probably more of those far afield. Definitely something that we are looking at, but probably for us, it's maintaining that channel.
I think you had your hand up there for a moment, so it looked like you were going to make a quick comment.
Yeah, just on similar with the roads and stuff, we looked at all of that with operations especially. So just, I know historic doesn't always, indicate the future, but just being able to see any historic context there from operations was really useful, knowing that there's alternative routes and things like that. But also we went with the electrical engineers and, and mechanical engineers for any critical infrastructure, not just for us, but around that could affect the port as well. So that was a key part of our analysis as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. Good question, Ben. And I think a lot of these things, the port situation is one that brings them up to the surface quite starkly, but they're actually very similar for a lot of other organisations as you look at your position in the value chain and your exposure as an organisation to connections and relationships that could get affected by climate change. Thank you very much indeed for getting through as much as we have done in a fairly short time that we had. Thank you for everybody for joining us. I hope we have at least answered some of the questions that you had, and that it's been interesting to hear the different contexts between port and the ports that Flinders Port Holdings operates. And thank you, James, for sharing your oversight and view of the broader industry. It's always helpful. And thank you to PIANC and to Andrew for the introduction. It's always a pleasure to have a chance to share these insights on how we know how difficult this process is and how much learning there is to do. So thank you very much indeed, everybody involved.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Simon.
Thanks, Simon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time. Thank you, Crystal. Really appreciate that.
Cheers.